Hi, I'm James Ward, a technical evangelist for Flex at Adobe. So I wanted to give you a quick walkthrough of how to integrate Flex with Java. So first, let's start off with a quick overview of how Flex and Java work together. So Flex is a client-side UI technology, and we really use Java mostly these days for back-end server processing and web applications. If you're familiar with how we've done web applications in the past, we would run Java code on the server and it would output HTML markup, and then that HTML would be rendered in the browser. With Flex, it's a little bit different because our Flex application is actually going to run client side. So what happens is we need to compile our Flex application into the bytecode for Flash Player, and then we execute the Flex application on the client side in the Flash Player, just using it as a virtual machine. So the Flash Player is the runtime, and then our Flex application needs to have some way to fetch the data from our database or make updates. And there's a lot of different ways that we can do that. I'm going to walk through the three most prominent ways of integrating Flex with Java in this method. So let's go into Eclipse. And what I've done is I've installed the Flash Builder 4 plugin for Eclipse into my Eclipse, and then I've created a dynamic web project which has some Java code already in it. So let's go take a look at my backend and what I've created. So first is a census service Java object. So this is really just a POJO, and all that it really does is it goes out to my database via JDBC, does a select statement, and returns some records, some census value object records, and returns those. So that's it. So what I've done to show the first method for how we're going to integrate Flex with Java is I've created a JSP. So this JSP really is just a simple way to call this method on the server and turn it into serialized XML data. So what I do is I get my census service, I then call the getElements method on it. I'm going to get 5,000 records and then return XML. So let's go take a look at this JSP here in my browser. So this is going out now to the server, getting the data from the database, and then serialize it into XML. So there we go. There's my 5,000 records. We can see all that XML here. And so what I'm going to do is now build the Flex client to call this JSP and get this data and render it into a data grid. Let's go back in here to Eclipse, and now I'm going to go create a new, and let's create a Flex project. And let's call this one the Flex client. We can choose at this point if we want it to be a web application or a desktop application. I'll leave it as a web application. I'm going to use the Flex 4 SDK, tell it to connect to a Java server, and specify the information for where my server is, and then just hit finish. So now what this is going to do is it's going to create the Flex application for me. So here's my Flex application. It's going to compile this Flex application, and it's actually going to put that compiled version of this application into the WAR file. So here we see the different files for this application inside my WAR file. So now let's write some Flex code. So I'm using MXML. Flex is a combination of MXML and ActionScript. I'm going to be focusing mostly today on the MXML aspect. So I'm going to use an HTTP service. So HTTP service is just the general HTTP networking library in Flex. I'm going to give this an ID. I'll call it SRV. This just specifies the variable identifier for this instance of this HTTP service object. And then I'm going to specify the URL. So I'm just going to use this JSP URL and then close that tag. Now let's have some visual way to, in our application, to render this data. I'm going to use the data grid control. And then I'm going to set the data provider. There's different ways to set the data on this data grid. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use data binding. Everything in Flex is really event driven. So what's going to happen is I'm going to set up a watcher to watch a property on the HTTP service object for changes, and whenever that property changes, it's then going to tell the data grid about that change, and then the data grid will render that data. So what we're going to watch is srv.lastResult and then .items.item. And what I'm actually doing is using the dot notation to traverse down the deserialized data that's been returned from calling this JSP. And if we look back here at this XML, we see that there's this items node and then repeated item nodes. So Flex is automatically going to translate that XML into objects for us, and when we get the response back and deserialize, it's going to update the last result property with the data that we've just got back from calling that JSP. Last thing to do is to actually make the request, and there's two different ways that we could do that. Let's actually let's go in here and set a application complete event handler. So this is an event that gets thrown when our application is initialized. What I'm going to do is just call srv.send, and this particular JSP doesn't require any HTTP request parameters, so we'll just leave that empty. So there we go. That's our application. What I've done is I've saved it. It's compiled this application, and then the compiled version is here in our WAR file. So now when we run this, it's actually going to run this Flex application here in our browser. We're making the request to our WAR file. It's pulling up an HTML page and then loading that application, our Flex application, in Flash Player and running that client side. So what happened was when the application loaded, it made the request for the JSP, got the XML data, pulled it down to the client side, deserialized that XML into objects, and then updated this data grid with that data that was fetched from the XML. So this is the Flex data grid, so it supports things like client-side sorting. We can drag these columns around and resize them, and we can see there's all 5,000 records here on the client. So super fast to get this data down from the client or from the server down to the client. So that was great. Pretty easy now to interact with our backend Java services. So let me move on now to the next method for how we can connect a Flex application to a Java backend. So if we look back here at my Java source code and the census service, what we'll actually see here is that I've added some annotations onto this POJO. I'm using the JSR 181 Java Web Services to actually expose this POJO out. And if we look at the web XML, we can see that I've mapped a servlet for the census SOAP service and then set up a servlet mapping for that. So now we can actually pull up the WSDL for this SOAP service. So this is the WSDL that was automatically created for me with the JSR 181 annotations. So now let's go and build the Flex application that can connect to that web service. So I'm just going to use the same Flex application here, but I'm going to make a couple changes. So I'm going to actually change this HTTP service. Instead of using just the plain old HTTP service library, I'm going to use the web service library. And then I'm going to need this WSDL URL. So let's go copy that. And instead of setting the URL property, I'm going to set the WSDL property. And then let's put in here the WSDL location. So that's how I define my web service. And then rather than doing srv.send, what I'm actually now going to do is actually make the method call on this web service. And so that's just going to be get elements. And then that takes two parameters, so the begin and the count. So let's begin at 0 and do 5,000. And then next thing we need to change is that in my data grids data provider, in my binding expression, I now need to actually watch srv.getElements.lastResult. And I can take off this items.item because now the items are just going to be on the last result property. So now let's save this, and let's actually change this from 5,000 to 6,000 just so we can verify that this thing's actually working. And let's go run this application again. So let's go back here, and let's go run this as a web application. So now we should see something similar. We should see our data grid, and there's our data grid. It's going out, fetching that data from the server, parsing, and then it should render that 6,000 rows here in the data grid. So it's parsing that WSDL data. So it took a little bit longer to do the parsing there. So here we go. We should see 6,000 rows, and so that's great. So same data grid, it's introspecting that data just like before to figure out what the columns are. You can of course explicitly set those columns if you want. So that's the second method for how we can interact with our Java backends. It's just through standard SOAP web services. The next method I'm going to use uses a set of libraries called BlazeDS. So this is an open source set of libraries. They're actually kind of the sibling of a commercial product called Lifecycle Data Services. And so the BlazeDS libraries, which you can get from opensource.adobe.com, what I've done is I've just copied those jar files here into my war files webinf lib directory. And then in my web XML, I've set up another servlet. It's a message broker servlet. And then I've mapped that to message broker. And then I've done a little bit of configuration here to define the channel, the AMF channel that we're going to be using. And then I've defined my remote object. So I have this remote object. I've given it an ID of census and then told it the Java class that we're going to use to remote to. So remoting is a little bit different than web services. It's actually going to use a binary serialization protocol between the client and the server that's much more efficient. If you actually want to see the differences between these, I built an application called Census. You can find it at jamesward.com/census that actually will compare the performance differences between AMF and SOAP and then just the plain old XML. And by far, the AMF is much faster from a server processing standpoint and from a client parsing standpoint. So that's our configuration for the remoting. So let's actually go in and change this application now to use remoting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch out this web service tag and I'm going to use a remote object tag instead. And so remote object, we'll leave it with the same SRV ID, and it doesn't have a WSDL. What we actually need to specify on this instead is we need to specify the destination that we're going to access, in this case census, and that's just from this remoting config file there, census. And then instead of the WSDL property, we're going to specify the endpoint property. So and then our endpoint is actually going to be the message broker /AMF endpoint, and that's what we define in our web XML and the services config. And then everything else should be pretty much the same. We're going to make the getElements method call. Let's increase this now to 20,000. So that's the total amount of data that I have in my database. And then once we get this data back, we're going to update the data grid via data binding. So let's save that and now go reload here in our browser. And we'll see we get a data grid. Here's our data grid, and there we go. We already got the data. So that was maybe a little too fast for you to see. So let's reload this so you can see it again here. So we're loading, and that was 20,000 rows loaded from the server down to the client. So we can verify it. There's all 20,000 rows there. We can still do the client-side sorting of this data super fast. So really, this is super fast way to get data from the server down to the client. And this also works both ways. So if we need to send objects up to the server, it's going to use AMF in that direction as well. So really, this is a great way to interact with our backend Java services. So what I've just showed you is really 3 different ways for how you can interact from a Flex application running client-side to a Java backend. And really, it's really easy to set up any of these 3 methods of interacting with our Java backend. My personal preference is usually to use the remoting remote object with BlazeDS. If you're using Spring, there's also an extension of Spring called the Spring Flex, and that allows you to easily map your remote objects from Spring Beans. So that's a great way to do it if you're using Spring. If you have Hibernate objects on the back end, those obviously will work as well, or whatever you're using on the back end should just work. So anyways, thanks for watching. I hope it was useful for you.